Hey everybody, welcome to another Practical Pet Chat. Thanks for joining us. Lauren, how you doing?
Good, Rob. How are you?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. And we got a really interesting question that I'm going to twist a little bit, but I think it's something that a lot of us deal with. And the question was about feeding different pets within the household. Let me flip it to, how do you focus on feeding the pets in your household? And in particular, when you've got a multi-pet household.
So, we're humans. We like routine, and we like to do the same thing over and over and over, and not really think outside the box for things that we think are routine, like feeding our fur kids. And I spent a number of years teaching people how to rotate and how to do different things, but it extends beyond just the food. You have to look at. I'll give you an example. I have a client right now who is got a number of seniors in her house. Um, Over the years, when I would deal with clients who I probably met them when their dog was a puppy or their cat was a kitten, and then they're with me over the years, and then 10 years later, they're like, "Well, I've always fed this." Right, but it's a different kid now. That kid is substantially older than it was 10 years ago, just from a species type of view. They obviously age much faster than we do. But it has to do too with supplements and things that you're going to give. I know we've talked about this before. I'm not a fan of just adding supplements for the sake of adding supplements. There aren't standard supplements that you should give. Like with every meal, you should give this, this, and this, no matter what. Doesn't matter what you're feeding, just every kid needs these, which isn't true because it depends on the kid. It depends on the age of the kid. It depends on the environment. Um, it depends on if that kid is exhibiting any signs of need for anything. Is there anything that the kid seems lacking in? And obviously, at one or two or three, those kids, much like when we were teenagers, we're at our healthiest, right? We're there's not a lot that we're lacking if we're eating well-rounded meals and doing that kind of thing. And we can withstand the things that maybe wouldn't be good for us, and maybe things that are lacking. But going back to the client I have that has seniors, when you get in a routine of doing the same thing all the time, it's like, well, I'm giving this for liver support and I'm giving this for, I always think they should have coconut oil or, well, shouldn't they always have a fish oil? It's the kind of things of, well, not all fish oils are the same. The administration of each one is different. The need is going to vary in the kid, the frequency of when you give it, whether or not you do breaks, because everything should be given breaks in the supplement world. And are you rotating brands and are you rotating, whether or not you give it based on what you're giving? For example, if you're feeding something that's fish, do you need to add a fish oil into it? You have to look at those things. And getting people out of that routine is difficult. So having 12 dogs, I unfortunately know about this firsthand. And every time I would make the base food, what I added or even what I subtracted would vary depending on which kid it was for. And all my kids were probably the same age at the same time within about a year or so of each other, a year or two. And, depending on we guessed, with the kids that we took off the street and those kinds of things. So you have to look at that. But if a kid doesn't do well with fish oil, then that kid doesn't get fish oil. It isn't automatically added to the food. Or if this kid has skin issues, dander, flakiness, that kind of thing, then they're going to need extra of something. And a liver support is great if it's needed and maybe at a certain age, and depending on what else is going on. Are you giving medications? Is there conventional stuff that's on board as well? Are there any physical issues, any diseases, anything like that? So you have to look at the kid that you're about to feed in front of you. And when you are addressing the needs of that one kid, what do you do specific to that kid?
Yeah.
And I think that's hard for people to get into that
Yeah.
habit.
I think it's such great points there. I love it, and we've got to talk further at some point on cycling and rotating, because I think that's a really important part of something you and I talk about a lot, which is that balance over time, which you kind of hit on when you said what you were doing in the beginning is not necessarily what you're doing 5 years, 7 years, 10 years later. And that feeding the pet in front of you, I think, what also struck me too is there's, as you mentioned, that propensity to, well, I'm doing this for one and they're thriving. So all of them will thrive on that.
Right.
And I think that there's that secondary element of if I've got multiples to feed, I mean, most people are doing it at the same time.
Mhm.
And I will say, if you got two, that's probably easy. But when you've got multiples, I've got a family member who's got three dogs and had three cats. So you've got to also rotate the times that you're
Mhm.
feeding, watch to make sure, because the minute you put those bowls down, if only two of the three are eating, but all three bowls end up empty, who was the culprit who got the extra serving? And you got to watch all those different things. And why wasn't that third one in there eating? And was it, the environment, especially when it comes to cats? They're already, a bit finicky, but you got to give everybody their space. Certain breeds of
Mhm.
dogs, Bella and I'm sorry, Sugar and Zoe never had any issues until occasionally their favorite meal. And if I put those bowls too close, they let me know, hey, you know, we got a little bit of a standoff going. But that's that challenge of also feeding the pet in front of you means watching, being there. The way that I feed, now I've got one dog now. So Bella, I can put it down, I can walk away. I'm not worried about it. I don't think the kids are going after it, the tortoises, et cetera. Right. But when we have a second dog, I will go back to that. I'm there. This is feeding time. You eat, and then it goes up and away. Water's always there. Food is not. Um, and that's another change. A lot of folks will say, "Oh my gosh, no! I just put the bowl down. And I leave it there." And I'm like,
Oh my gosh, that makes me
how do you know
crazy.
which animal is eating that? You know, and I've got a really good friend who had again cats and dogs, and had a dog that until we had a conversation, they weren't realizing that if the cat touched the food at all, the dog was like, "I'm out. I hate that. I'm not. Nope." Which made me kind of chuckle.
Ew,
Yeah,
cooties.
yeah, cat cooties. Can't be
Cat
having cat cooties
cooties.
on my food. Yeah. So, but it is again just going back to each individual pet has their own individual needs. I love that you point that out. And then on that rotating as well, you may not have to do that for each pet, but chances are, if you've got multiples, you certainly need to be employing that for at least one of them. So I like that a lot. But why is it so hard, do you think, for folks? You had a lot of people come in the store, they'd say, I'm doing this. Did it surprise you if people said, "What this I've been feeding this for the last 3 years?" Because that always surprises me.
It doesn't surprise me. It frustrates me because, you can say something 50 times to people and they don't hear it, but you got to keep saying it because maybe the 51st time they will.
Sure.
And, it's frustrating. Um, Back when the DCM thing was going on, the nutritional DCM thing was going on, of course, there's panic everywhere. And it was the first time I'd ever done a Facebook Live because I hate being on camera. and I had never done them. And it was like I felt so strongly about how inaccurate this was that it forced me to do my first Facebook Live. The shock for me was, you know, talk about getting out of your comfort zone, um, was how many people watched that on my business Facebook page, to the extent that the next day I had a line outside my store before I opened. And I kind of opened it like, what's going on? And people are like, I saw your video. And I'm like, oh, okay. I had a client come in, she was a nurse. And I saw her frequently, and no one comes up to the counter with the same food they bought over and over, because we had a loyalty program. So I always knew what they were feeding. Where I don't say, you sure you don't want to try something else? Can I give you some samples? Because remember, you got to rotate. It's always good to rotate. Eating the same thing, same brand, same formula over and over and over, isn't good for anybody. You don't eat the same thing day in and day out. The whole spiel, it's almost a routine of the things that you say. And they're like, yeah, no, this is good. I was like, okay. And I get samples in when I could. But I almost couldn't hide it, because she said, it just never even occurred to me. And I said, well, every time you've come in and I've rung you up, I've mentioned it to you. And she goes, no, you haven't. I'm like, absolutely, I have. Absolutely. 1,000%. You couldn't be a customer here that it wasn't told to you, because we feel so strongly about it. We understand the benefit of rotation and the negatives of the lack of rotation. And and there are exceptions to everything, kids with extreme sensitivities or allergies or whatever. But her kid wasn't one of those kids. And she left that day with 3 different flavors and 3 different brands. And I was like, right there, that was worth doing it. But it
Yeah.
repeated over and over and over as we worked through the line of people, that needed help and had questions and needed clarification. And it's disappointing from the viewpoint of, does it take something extreme like a recall or something profoundly negative to get people's attention? Because it shouldn't. It should be, and to your question as to why do I think that's the case, we're humans. We're deeply flawed. If we were perfect, we'd be animals, and, specifically dogs, but we'd be animals. And they don't fend for themselves. They're in our houses. So they become facultative to what we give them, whether it's appropriate, whether it's rotational, whatever it is. And it's stressful for someone like me who, had a store, and I realized the benefit of rotational nutrition, and trying to get people to understand that, and taking your wins where you could, but
Sure.
never letting up on the people who resisted change. It's convenient. And then people come back and go, well, sometimes my spouse feeds and they're just not going to do that. Okay, that's the one off.
Right.
It's the one off of nachos and beer isn't nutritionally, well rounded, but that doesn't mean that occasionally that doesn't happen. And, that's dinner, or something like that. And it's the one off, and you go back to normal food, hopefully, from there. But with every excuse that people have, we developed a response to that because we understood the effect, short term and long term, on the animals. And I think we're just flawed with we're creatures of habit. We don't like to think outside the box. We don't like the stress of, well, what if they won't eat it? We don't like the stress of thinking about it. We don't want to have to put the work in. And it's work, because for you, when you separated your dogs, I had 12. We only fed one kid at a time,
Yeah.
and when we went through one kid, fed that kid, went on to the next kid, fed that kid, because we're also fixing the food for that kid. With 2 kids, and I have little bitty kids, and they get a lot. I mean, my kids are so respectful of each other, we separate them. One kid's fed in one room that we close the door and the other kid's fed in the other room. But if one kid comes out and the other kid's still licking her bowl, she stands back and waits. And the other
Wow.
kid does the same thing. And we marvel at that because we didn't teach them that. And they are like, oh, you're not done. And of course, we're so proud, because we're proud parents that, oh, look at them. They have manners, and it's like, no, they probably realize that that's probably not something you want to do. And nobody
Yeah.
wants to take that on. But I'm not naive enough to think that at any point in time that couldn't possibly change. They age, maybe somebody doesn't feel well, something pops up where a kid gets defensive, another kid gets aggressive, anything could happen. So we just automatically put that in place where nobody has to protect what they're eating. They get to eat and be comfortable while they're eating for as long as it takes for them to eat, which is no time at all. And then everybody's back together licking each other's bowl. What did you get? Oh, let me see
Yeah.
what you got, and licking the bowl and it's all good. But,
Yeah.
I think people need to take those things into consideration just to prevent possibilities of things gone wrong.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too because you just said something too that each animal also feeds differently and eats differently.
Mhm.
I thought about we were Bella's third family, and she was still, tiny puppy, tiny, tiny, fit in the palm of my hand. And one of the unique eating things that we saw was she would take a mouthful of food and then walk away from everybody, drop it down, and then eat it. And I used to say, like, are you baby birding yourself? And, after the second and third time, I was like, okay, in one of the environments she was in before us, she had to get her food and find a safe place for her to then consume that away from whoever else she was around. That
Are
was
you
her.
assuming that? Are you making that assumption?
I'm making that assumption from what I heard, and we got her because she was attacked by a bigger dog that ripped her ear. So I think that's where I kind of concluded, and it took a while to. And she was so terrified. She would literally cling onto my pants and my leg. We had to do a lot of training with a professional trainer to give her the confidence that she now has. But in around big dogs. She actually is more comfortable now around big dogs than she is little dogs. Um, from the standpoint of she loves little dogs because she's their protector, but the bigger dogs, she's confident enough now to not feel she's going to be attacked. Um, but she now eats right out of her bowl. Like she's got no problem now. That habit quickly was like I'd sit down with her. I'm like, you're safe. It's all good. Nobody's taking your food. You're good.
That's interesting because a lot of my clients have asked me about that takeaway
Yeah.
practice that a lot of dogs
Interesting.
do.
Okay.
And they're dogs that maybe didn't have previous situations similar to Bella's. Um, and and it's interesting. I pondered that often because, everything to me is I want to know every angle of it. And,
Sure.
it's interesting that some dogs will take their food away. So I've gotten down to with certain clients of, how do you feed? Do you feed? Is it there all the time? Do you feed a mealtime? Do you feed on the floor or on carpet? Is it on a mat? Does the dog take it to carpet to eat it? And it's almost always, of course, kibble. So I'm going to assume that Bella was kibble as well.
Oh yeah.
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 So it's
Yeah.
always kibble. And I've had people tell me, well, she takes it over there and then she'll eat one piece of kibble at a time.
Oh,
And
interesting.
I've had other people tell me, well, she'll take it to her bed, and I go, well, that's probably home base. That's a safe zone.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to try to understand their perspectives on that. It's also
Yeah.
interesting that it's always kibble.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but there's things mixed in for her. So, it can be a piece of broccoli. It can be she's still going to take that out at that time. So, because I mix in, um, I put a lot of things on, which is another thing feeding, the dog. Um, and I used to make a lot of homemade only. I've got, some allergy issues in our house that number one, and you said something too that also caught me on this. But number one, I'm always concerned about. But number two, um, from the standpoint of I traveled a lot and I didn't expect my family, if I didn't have time to meal prep like I would typically do on Sundays, you know, lightly cook, sous vide things, etc. They're not going to do
Sure.
that. They're like, hey, Dad, what's this thing in the water? Can we just, not a problem. Don't worry about it. It's either there, or it's not. There's always a bag of kibble. There's always fresh things to put on top of it. Um, I also do like gravies. I do have supplements. I do cycle a lot of different things. And I wanted to point that out is that's the easiest way, even if you're, in that convenience mode, there are so many easy ways to elevate and get some not only fresh items in there, but give at least some additional, I'm not going to say it's rotation, but things within the mix of the food. There's not a lot that's required, especially because when you're watching your pets, and that's 2 points on that. One, Bella used to love certain kinds of vegetables, certain kind of fruits, and her taste has changed over the years.
Hmm.
And so you said, well, people are afraid, they're not sure if they're going to like it. But what if they do like it?
Right.
It's like, hey, if they do like it, wow, this is great.
Right.
Because if you notice a shift in the body, and oh, hey, someone's getting a little bit, pleasantly plump. Okay, well, we can shift, some of what's being fed into some healthier things because we know they like that, as opposed to trying it at that point. Because the first time most people try anything, they're skeptical, they're not sure. I got to assume it's the same. That's been my experience. But the secondary part too is, um, I just had the situation with Belle where she had some uh, really deep work done. And I had to figure out a way to feed her and also give her these huge, pills to deal with any infections and things like that.
You talking about dentals?
I had some dental, yeah, Belle had some dental done. And so luckily she came out good. No, she didn't lose any teeth or anything like that. But we were still concerned about infection and other things going on. Long story short, though, was you can't do that in a kibble environment.
Right.
And oh, yeah, by the way, for the next, first 10 days, she really needed to be eating softer foods, not too mushy that could get up into those pockets that were just so nicely cleaned. So there was that, like, how do you do that and still meet all of these different things? And so if you haven't practiced rotating or you haven't tried other things, and I always found it to be a positive. If they don't like it, good. I know now, and I don't need to worry about that. One thing that was interesting with Sugar and Zoe that I found was they did have different appetites and they liked different things, which became a way for me to identify for them. This is your bowl because it's got the things you like. This is her bowl because it's got the things she likes. And they just did not share a lot of the same tastes. So, kind of a fun, unique thing. And one last note on all that was if you're not feeding the pet in front of you and you're not watching and you're not participating, there are some really serious health concerns that can come up with bloat and other things. Because I used to call Zoe, she was my Hoover, meaning she would just inhale the second you put it down. So we had to switch the kind of bowls that we used to different feeding bowls. And, this is again 10, 15 years ago before that was the rage of things. And we were
Right.
actually creating, ironically, missed opportunity. But it was like, how do we slow her down on some of this? Here's how we're going to do this. Um, that's really important. So a lot of different elements that you touched on. And I do have to say at 12, I mean, that's like I can't even fathom that because I sometimes struggle
Yeah.
with,
It,
2 plus.
yeah. Well, I have two right now, and I marvel at the fact that I had 12 and think about how did we do that day after day after day after day? Because they were also all very long-lived, thankfully. Um, I, anyway, everything changes. Um, Couple of things.
Yeah.
Uh, bloat tends to occur more often in kibble-fed animals. This is a
Yep.
side note. And mushy stuff really isn't an issue. I just have to clarify, sorry, because I feed
Yeah.
I feed, homemade food or gently cooked food or things like that. I don't ever feed kibble. And it doesn't get, as you know, one of my dogs just had a dental. And if stitches are done properly in those pockets, then nothing's really going to get into them. I just wanted to put that out there for people concerned about, what they might feed and that kind of stuff. That's not going to be an issue. But along with that, I think we should do an episode at some point on something called self-selection because it's really interesting if you, and this is fun too, if you want to see at different points in your dog's life what your dog is interested in eating, and your dog is actually capable of telling you what it's missing,
Yeah.
So bananas, broccoli, which my dogs will not touch, green beans, other things like that.
Yep.
In other countries where people take their dogs out walking through, the woods, forests, not just hiking trails, those kinds of things, where there's
Right.
actually natural vegetation. And I'm thinking what comes to mind specifically is the UK. It's interesting how dogs will gravitate towards and eat specifically the things that they know they're lacking. And
Yeah.
it's fascinating when you actually get into that and take a look at um, how animals operate that way instinctively. It's a whole nother level of respect that you have for their ability. Processed food is dead food. I mean, it doesn't
Right.
matter if it's our food or their food. And I'm not calling out any brands because it doesn't matter the brand. If it's a processed
Right.
food, it's a dead food. So the fact that you add things to it really is important and necessary in terms of real food, um, and change that up.
Yeah. Well, and I love that you talked about they will self-select as well. That was one of the things that drew me deeper into the herbal world. You know,
Right.
the it's not just dogs, it's all animals.
Hmm.
They're able to really self-identify, I need this. And when you think about it, it's crazy because they didn't go to some school, they didn't take an online class, they didn't, you know,
No,
somebody's phenomenal book.
they don't have a certificate.
Yeah, it's in their DNA to, pick that out. And I'm always somewhat tickled and fascinated because we're fortunate we've got some land, so there's a lot of things that grow. And when I see the different animals going and specifically picking out certain things in different areas, it's a note for me. Oh, okay, all right, so and so is hitting
Eating
on this.
dandelions. Yeah,
Yeah, any of it. We've got mint, we've got all these other things
sure.
too. And you just look and you go, oh, okay. So I love that. We definitely have to do that. I think that's
Yeah.
a tremendous talking point. And with that in mind, if there is an area that you all want us to talk about, you've got an idea, you'd love to hear Lauren's thoughts, maybe a few of my thoughts, please send us those emails, practicalpetchat@gmail.com. We have appreciated all the different feedback, suggestions. As you can see, today's episode very much driven by feedback from you all. And when we hear a number of you giving us these suggestions, we try and bring them together in one episode so that we're hitting on that. So I know we kind of covered a number of different things, but Lauren, I just want to say, as always, thank you. Great insights. Audience, thank you for spending time with us. We know how valuable your
Thanks,
time is.
guys. Yep.
Visit us on all the different social media channels. Watch the videos wherever you watch videos. Listen to us wherever you listen to your audio podcasts. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
The
content of this podcast is for informational purposes only. It is not intended as, nor should it be construed as, professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment for your pets. Always seek the advice of a qualified veterinarian with any questions you may have regarding your pet's health or medical condition. Never disregard professional veterinary advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this podcast. The hosts and the guests of this podcast are not liable for any actions taken based on the information shared during these episodes. Any reliance on the information provided is solely at your own risk. Copyright 2025 Practical Pet Chat, all rights reserved. Unauthorized duplication, distribution, or reproduction of any content from this podcast, including but not limited to audio, scripts, and show notes, is prohibited without prior written consent. The opinions and views expressed by the host and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of Practical Pet Chat.